Good evening to viewers in Asia, and a very good morning to those joining me here in Washington. My name is Antoinette Saye, and I'm a Deputy Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund. It is my true pleasure to welcome all of you to a policy dialogue on what is perhaps the most defining challenge of our lifetimes. Leaving behind a stable environment for our future generation is, of course, our moral responsibility. But it is also an economic imperative. Climate change presents risks to global economic and financial stability and has an adverse impact on our livelihoods. This is why dealing with the macroeconomic aspects of climate change has become central to the IMF's work. It also explains why you see finance ministers and central bank governors in this discussion with us today. So let me introduce them. First, joining the IMF in co-organizing this session is Indonesia's Minister of Finance and the co-chair of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, Sri Mulyani Indrawati. Indonesia, as you know, will take the helm of the G20 next year, and climate change will figure prominently on its agenda. Let me also welcome the Managing Director of Singapore's Monetary Authority, Ravi Menon, and the Governor of the Central Bank of Philippines, Benjamin Diokno. We will also hear a brief message from Thailand's Minister of Finance, Arkham Termpitaya Paisit, who unfortunately could not join us for the discussion. And I very much look forward to an engaging discussion with our esteemed panel. Before we begin, though, let me just make a few introductory remarks. Now, the stakes on climate are high for the Asia-Pacific region, which accounts for about half of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. It is also likely to suffer the most from climate change, including from more frequent extreme weather events, as we have seen in recent years. Asia-Pacific is not alone. Tackling this issue is urgent and challenging everywhere. It requires nothing less than large-scale transition to green economies. And managing such a transition will require comprehensive policies. It is also an area where no country can go it alone. From an IMF perspective, we see four such policy elements. First is to arrest the accumulation of emissions, we must put a robust price on carbon, one that can send a signal to the market and change incentives. Whether implemented through carbon taxes, emissions trading system, regulation, or other measures, that is to local policy preferences. What matters is getting to net zero at the earliest possible time. Second, the revenues coming from such a carbon price must be invested in building climate smart infrastructure. This can unlock the potential of green financing to support the investment that is essential to such a transition. Third, this transition to green economy must also be a just transition. That means supporting workers as they move from shrinking to expanding sectors. It also means the international community supports countries that face the twin challenge of increasing energy access and reducing carbon footprint. And as we prepare for such a transition, we must also recognize that climate change is a real and present issue for many countries, which is why, and this is my fourth point, why countries must also invest in climate change adaptation and resilience, even with very limited resources, so they can protect lives and livelihoods and reduce the detrimental impact of climate change on people. So as I lay out these policy priorities, I recognize, of course, that we are still only emerging from an unprecedented pandemic. But this is also the moment when countries are planning their recovery policies. And as they do so, they have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to plan a sustainable economy. The best part is that doing so also offers opportunities for growth and jobs. Research by IMF staff shows how deficit-financed green supply policies could raise global GDP by about 2% this decade and create millions of new jobs. Tackling climate change is a global public good, and the international community must play a critical role. It is in our common interest, for advanced economies to fulfill their commitment to provide $100 billion a year in climate finance to the developing world, so they can continue in earnest with efforts to mitigate against and adapt to climate change. A transfer of green technologies is also critical in this effort and ultimately the best option. Advanced economies can help develop clean, competitive technologies that can also be used by emerging and developing economies. The IMF is also stepping up to support member countries in this effort by integrating climate into our annual economic health checks, our bilateral surveillance of countries and financial systems, and by sharing our policy advice. In the context of our recent allocation of 650 billion of special drawing rights, or SDRs, we are also exploring the creation of a resilience and sustainability trust. This trust would aim to support resilient and sustainable growth in the post-pandemic period, including resilience to climate change. And it could especially benefit low-income, poorer, and vulnerable middle-income countries. So we clearly have a lot of work ahead of us, which is why I'm glad that we have an important group of minister and of finance and governors with us today who can share their perspectives and policy actions to help us transition to net zero emissions and build a climate resilient economy. Let me now warmly invite Minister Sri Mulyani as the co-organizer of this session to deliver her opening remarks. Minister, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antoinette. Excellency Pak Ravi Menon, Managing Director, Monetary Authority of Singapore. Excellency Mr. Benjamin Diokno, the Governor of Central Bank of Philippines. My dear friends, Antoinette Sayed, Deputy Managing Director of International Monetary Funds, and all participants, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to really express my appreciation for all the distinguished panelists who will spare their valuable time to join this public policy dialogue and later will share their view and thought addressing the issue which is very important for the world. Special thanks I extend to the IMF for their good partnership in co-hosting this event. I also hope that this event will be able to provide share experiences and foster peer-to-peer exchange in our endeavor to achieve a more sustainable and inclusive recovery, particularly in Southeast Asia. Our colleague, the signal of the global economic recovery currently continues to be strong. As we can see, the manufacturing activity have been reviving, international trade also has been picking up, and economic growth in many countries has been rebounding. However, we also acknowledge that the risks are still present. In the midst economic and business recovery process, especially for addressing the issue COVID-19 pandemic or post-pandemic, Indonesia is also facing with opportunity and challenges to implement low carbon transition during economic recovery process. This transformation promises sustainable growth and prosperity in the long run, but it's also create a quite a daunting trade-off in the short run. So the recovery as well as this transformation toward lower carbon emission also creates another risk, especially for the workforce and society in the short run and medium run. And that is exactly the policy choice and how we are going to design a less trade-off, especially for the workforce and society. The UNFCCC has noted that 1.5 billion workers will be affected by the transition. And according to the SDG and the Paris Agreement concept, social inclusion will continue to influence, shape, and direct various collective efforts related to climate change and human development, adhering to the leave no one behind principle. And this is really require quite a lot of thoughtful discussion, as well as how we can best respond to this very challenging task. Indonesia currently also preparing employment into green transition that will be aligned with our policy and program on human resource development, including our policy and program toward the vision of Indonesia 2045. That is when hopefully Indonesia will celebrate 100 years of our independence. Indonesia priority has been very clear. That is to protect our people's life, health, and well-being. In this regard, we have strengthened the social protection program, and this is especially very, very critical during this pandemic COVID-19 situation, and also increase our budget allocation for health and education. We continue complementing the role of our National Economic Recovery Program in 2021 with the aim to alleviating this health crisis, provide social assistance as well as support business activities so that they are going to be able to recover stronger. Those program and policy has been resulting in positive impact to our economy. Our second quarter growth 2021 has been rebound and recover at 7.07%. And this is driven mainly by the consumption, investment, as well as a very strong export and import. A signal of our economic recovery is clearly underway. But we are not going to just satisfy with this accelerated recovery. We have to think harder how we are going to be able to integrate the recovery in a more sustainable, especially recognizing that climate change is going to be another threat to the whole humanity, including for Indonesia. We use all the fiscal tools, whether this is in the form of incentive on a taxation, spending, including subsidy, and financing. One of our innovative financing, recently we just issued Government of Indonesia SDG bond, which is the issuance of 500 euro in the lowest ever rate, which is the objective of these bonds is to finance the SDG program, including climate change. This is the first Asia conventional SDG bond issuance, and this is also show our leadership as well as strong commitment toward sustainable finance and also SDG target. The government will allocate all the proceeds from this issuance of SDG bond to fund projects that qualify for eligible SDG expenditure within SDG framework. This also includes capital spending on physical asset of essential social and environmental services, operating expenditure in relation to the provision of public service and public goods, and also supporting government entity, public-private partnership with the availability payment. This is especially very important when we are preparing for the green project. The issuance of the SDG bond showed that the government of Indonesia committed to finance social and environmental projects to realize our 2030 goals of sustainable development. Our colleague Indonesia is also actively engaged and support many fora to implement climate global action. Issues related to climate change and sustainable development cannot be solved by countries individually, as Antoinette mentioned earlier. It requires global collective commitment and action. This issue have massively become a priority agenda in many international forums, including to our G20 forum, which Indonesia is going to host and preside, and on the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. Also, we are discussing this issue on the ASEAN forum and major economic forum, including on the energy and climate. And also we discuss very closely on our bilateral discussion with the US government. In G20, we have Sustainable Finance Working Group, a new working group which is established to aim to formulate concrete action. That is through developing an enabling environment that would mobilize international financing. The G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group has made significant progress in developing the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap. This roadmap is designed to form a high-level, forward-looking common view of the priority for scaling up sustainable finance and to support the objective of 2030 SDG as well as Paris Agreement. The roadmap is expected to focus on 5 key areas. The first, market development. And this is also very critical. Indonesia is in the process of providing legislation and providing a policy framework in order for us to be able to establish and form a carbon market. This is, of course, the objective is to align investment on sustainable goals, including for the climate finance. The second one, consistent, comparable, and reliable information on sustainable risk, opportunity, and impact. The third issue is the assessment and management of climate and sustainable risk. And the fourth one, leveraging public finance policy and incentive. And the last one, the cross-cutting issue, including using the digital technology and transition finance. We will continue and oversee this roadmap for the next G20 presidency in 2020-2022 in order to make a progress in guiding countries toward sustainable financing, financial transition, taking into account our national circumstances. Indonesia finance ministers, together with the Finnish Ministry of Finance, are co-chairing the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. The coalition serves as a platform to support collective effort of members' country finance ministers in utilizing fiscal policy, public finance management, and climate finance, and mobilizing to encourage domestic as well as global climate change action. In this coalition, we exchange our experiences and information related to fiscal policy, economic policy correlated with climate change. For example, on carbon market and carbon pricing, green budgeting, and mobilizing private sources of climate finance. In carrying this activity, the coalition is guided by the Helsinki Principle 6, aspirational and non-binding principle, that is to promote national climate action, especially through fiscal policy and public finance. We also express our appreciation and thank you for the IMF as well as the World Bank support in this coalition work, which have played a very active role in setting the agenda as well as overseeing the work stream in this coalition. We all know that the ability to develop and implement green recovery strategy will vary across a country. It should also be considered the context of avoiding a deeper global recession. Low and middle income nations will have less fiscal space to go beyond their initial emergency responses than high income countries. And to speed up this recovery process, several concrete actions are needed through developing an enabling environment that would mobilize international finance, including the implementation of commitment from developed countries as well as participation of the multilateral development banks. That's also include the private sector participation. The MDBs and international financial institutions like IMF can play a very vital role with their comprehensive knowledge, convening power, and of course, on the financial side. We have to give the right signal to investors and financial institutions that sustainable finance should be universally treated with more lenient terms and conditions, especially in terms of pricing, interest rate, than the conventional financing. Without proper pricing, sustainable finance cannot help developing countries toward a just and affordable transition. Finally, a green, inclusive, and resilient recovery can boost economic activity. This is not all about financing and cost, but also a new opportunity, especially for many technology companies as well as professionals who want to look at the recovery process as a way in developing their professional skills. We also need to design the transformational transition, which is inclusive, so that the participation of the society and business community can be heard and can be accommodated. Without that support, I think it will be impossible for us to push forward the progress in the climate change agenda. Achieving this aim will require a concrete efforts and also a commitment from all actors in the global economy. So I would like to thanks for all the speakers as well as participants. We do hope that this event can continue mobilize the support as well as educating and informing decision-making process in a very impactful way. Thank you very much.
And thank you so very much, Sri Mulyani, for that powerful statement with very insightful remarks on Indonesia and on what is required at the international level as well. Very grateful for that. We'll now hear a message, a brief message from Minister Arkham from Thailand, who unfortunately couldn't be with us here today. So we'll go to the video immediately.
Excellency Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Minister of Finance, Indonesia, Ms. Antoinette Saye, Deputy Managing Director, the International Monetary Fund, fellow governors, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you all. It is my pleasure to join you at the high-level public policy dialogue today. I would like to extend my appreciation to our host, the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia, and the IMF for arranging this event. As we are all aware, sustainability has become the defining issue of our time. In this connection, Thailand has joined international community in committing to the United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement. We have realigned our policies towards such goals. Earlier this year, Thailand announced the implementation of the Bio-Circular Green Economic Model, or BCG model, in a holistic manner as our national agenda to achieve recovery alongside balanced, inclusive, and sustainable growth. Ladies and gentlemen, recognizing the country's vulnerable climate change, the Ministry of Finance has placed significant consideration to incorporate green and sustainable economy to our agenda. In terms of financial instruments, we successfully issued a sustainability bond in August last year, the first of its kind in ASEAN. Since then, the outstanding size of the bond has now reached our target of over $3.2 billion. Apart from the financial instrument, fiscal measures remain central to our policy to accelerate the green growth, particularly the automobile excise tax based on the amount of CO2 emission. Granted, excise tax is incentive to promote green and sustainable automotive production, and the recent Procurement Act, which allows the government agencies to procure environmentally and friendly supplies. In addition, we have accomplished the development of sustainable finance initiative for Thailand to serve as a framework for driving sustainable finance across the financial sector. The initiative envisioned that the Thai financial sector will play a significant role in financing the real economy's transition towards sustainability. Ladies and gentlemen, last but not least, amid all challenges, we must stand firm and united in our pursuit for sustainability. Similar to the COVID-19 crisis, climate change is a global issue that needs global solution. Thank you for your kind attention. สวัสดีครับ
Our thanks to Minister for that message, very, very important message. We've heard from him and we're grateful for that. We certainly are very sorry that he's not here with us, but we want to, of course, get to hear from our panelists. And I think I'll start maybe with the first round of questions to Managing Director Menon and Governor Diokno, giving Sri Mulyani a few minutes a break and then bringing her into the second round. So let me start with Managing Director Menon. You know, it's Singapore was, of course, among the first Asian central banks to issue a sustainability report amidst the pandemic. And with that clear leadership, I wondered if you could speak to us about what role you see central banks and the financial sector playing in the fight against climate change in the run-up with the recovery as well. Managing Director, please. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Deputy MD Antoinette Saye. And first, I'd like to thank the IMF and Indonesian Ministry of Finance for taking the initiative to convene this panel. And also my greetings to Minister Sri Mulyani and also to my colleague, Governor Benjamin Diokno from the Philippines. How the world responds to the climate challenge over the next 10 years will determine the future of generations to come. And as Antoinette pointed out at the start of the session, the stakes are particularly high in Asia. Asia accounts for half the world's greenhouse gas emissions. We know that, and I think that's uppermost in our minds. Temperatures are also rising 2 times faster in Asia than the global average. So it's good that there's a renewed sense of urgency and commitment to the climate agenda. We've all seen the latest IPCC report, which says that there remains a very narrow pathway to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. It's a very small pathway. If I were a betting person, I'd say it's probably not going to happen. But it will require decisive action, and we must give it a shot. And COP26 in Glasgow this November is an important milestone and call to action. And in this regard, I should say, I really commend Indonesia's long-term strategy for low carbon and climate resilience. For a big, large developing country, it's a huge achievement, a huge commitment to peak greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by 2060. Coming to the financial system and why MAS is taking this so seriously, and as you said, we issued one of the world's first sustainability reports by a central bank. Because climate change poses very significant risks to the financial system. It also presents significant opportunities. And we do believe the financial sector plays a very important role, not only financing the important but challenging transition of countries to low carbon economies, but to also manage the physical risks of climate change and the transition risks of climate change for the financial system. So, I mean, Singapore is an international financial center. We want to play our part in financing Asia's transition towards a sustainable future. And we've been working very closely with our counterparts in the ASEAN central banks and ministries of finance, and also with central banks and regulators from around the world, basically to create a more conducive environment for sustainable financing opportunities, and also to safeguard against financial stability risks, which sometimes are not well appreciated. We are working very actively with the financial industry in 2 areas. One, strengthen the management of climate and environmental risks. They're not immediate, but they are big, and they are out in the future. Second is to encourage the development of green finance solutions and deepen green finance markets. You asked about what role central banks can play. I think there are three priorities for central banks and regulators to make green finance work effectively. First, improve the quality and availability and comparability of data. Second, develop compatible taxonomies for green and transition activities. And three, implement a consistent set of global standards for disclosure and reporting. So data, taxonomies, disclosure. These are three key. So first, data. Very difficult to get this data on emissions and so on. Technology is a potential game changer here in addressing some of the data challenges. It can help us to enhance the ability to monitor and manage environmental risks, address challenges in obtaining trusted, granular data to support high quality disclosures and efficient financial decision making. Second, in the area of taxonomy, there's been a lot of developments. At the international level, there are ongoing efforts, for example, at the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, which is very promising. It's actually developing a common ground taxonomy. I don't think there will be a single global taxonomy. Each country has its own peculiarities, but we should all try to work off a common, consistent, global set of principles. And this work that the IPSF is doing, it's developing a common ground taxonomy. It highlights the commonalities between existing taxonomies. So you can compare taxonomies when you're making a financing decision. Of course, within the regional level, ASEAN, I'm very happy to say we're developing a taxonomy for sustainable finance. And this will include transition activities and aim to be interoperable with international standards. So we want to be consistent with the major international taxonomies, but in Asia, we need to pay more attention to transition activities. So we're building this additional layer of taxonomy on top of it. The third, disclosure, here we're seeing very promising signs of convergence. So taxonomies, we will not get a single taxonomy. There'll be multiple taxonomies. We want them to be interoperable. On disclosure, there's a good chance that we can have a global baseline sustainability reporting standard. The work that the IFRS Foundation is doing here is really impressive. It's gaining strong momentum and traction over the last 1 year. And this will be instrumental in facilitating consistent, comparable disclosures of climate risk, which is actually very key to managing the risks, as well as in channeling the investments and financing to ensure impactful outcomes. Next, I want to close off by talking about the addressing of climate risks. Financial supervisors need to continue to advance our understanding of how climate risks can potentially impact financial institutions and financial systems. And we need to work very closely with the financial sector to strengthen their resilience against these risks. And we need to tackle this on both the micro and macro prudential fronts. On the micro prudential front, the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, of which the MAS is a founding member, has been doing very instructive work. We're chairing the work stream on microprudential supervision, which will issue a progress report on the work on integrating climate-related and environmental risks into supervisory frameworks. Today, our supervisory frameworks across the world, we don't have that, but we need a way to bring climate-related risks into our supervisory framework. The NGFS is also undertaking capacity building efforts. Most of us don't have the kind of capabilities that's required to make these supervisory assessments. So we're working closely with the Climate Training Alliance, which is a portal for training on climate risk for central banks and supervisors. It's established by COP26. Within Singapore, we've issued the Environmental Risk Management Guidelines last year. It applies to all financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, asset managers, financial advisors, the whole lot. It sets out expectations for financial institutions to assess, to monitor, to mitigate, and disclose environmental risks, as well as capacity building efforts coordinated by an industry level body. Finally, on the macro-prudential front, we are working towards conducting industry stress tests. I think this is key. We don't know how climate will change in the future. what we can do is to think of scenarios, assume certain things happening, and then stress test the balance sheets of financial institutions. So we're doing this under a range of climate scenarios. We're aiming to do this by the end of next year. And it will help, I think, both the MAS and the industry to understand the risks posed by climate change. We're also taking reference from global efforts, such as those by the NGFS, on charting these long-term climate scenarios. So this will be a very meaningful way in which we can embed climate change into risk assessments. Antoinette, you mentioned the sustainability report that we issued. Basically, it is to set an example of the change that we want to see. So we have started to disclose how we are incorporating climate change and environmental sustainability across all of the central bank's functions. So it talks about what we're doing together with the financial industry to manage the risks of climate, which I just explained, and what we're doing as an organization in our own right in the fight against climate change. So we are measuring our own carbon emissions, scope 1 and scope 2, and a good part of scope 3, but not completely yet. And we will develop a roadmap to set out viable strategies for emissions reductions. I think setting an example helps other financial institutions also to do likewise. So maybe with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to hear from my other panelists. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much, Managing Director Menon, for that response. Very comprehensive, showing clear leadership that Singapore has assumed and is really taking forward across a number of very important dimensions, including, the hugely important role of the central bank and all of the work you're doing at the global level on issues around taxonomy and data challenges, and very, very informative. Thank you so much. I wanted to turn to Governor Diokno and to give him an opportunity perhaps to tell us his views on maybe the role that central banks are playing in this important area, but more specifically to talk to us about commercial banks. I know you've mentioned before that commercial banks' involvement is key to finance investment for climate change reform. What can central banks do to promote sustainability, ESG principles in the banking and corporate sector? And to tell us a bit about what the Philippines is doing in that regard. Governor, please.
Well, I'd like to thank the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia and the IMF for co-sponsoring this high-level policy dialogue. And I'd like to congratulate also Finance Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati, and of course my colleague from Singapore, Ravi Menon. So on the question, what are we doing? Well, in championing the sustainability agenda in the financial system, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas adopted the Sustainable Central Banking Program as one of its corporate strategies. So we practice what we preach. We establish a sustainable central banking roadmap, which will provide a framework and milestones in the adoption of sustainability principles in the key operations of the central bank. The framework highlights the essential roles of the central bank as an enabler, mobilizer, and doer in advocating sustainability in the financial system. As an enabler, the BSP espouses a policy environment conducive to the adoption and growth of sustainable finance. In fact, in April 2020, we issued Sustainable Finance Framework, which underscores the pivotal roles of the Board of Directors and senior management on setting the tone and creating a culture that instills sustainability principles in all aspects of banks' governance, risk management systems, business strategies, and operations. Now soon, the BSP will supplement the Sustainable Finance Framework with more detailed risk management guidelines. Now, as a mobilizer, the BSP shall lead and influence financial institutions to carry out environmentally and socially responsible business decisions, and adopt green practices. This may include the adoption of green principles in the investment portfolio of financial institutions. On our part, we have invested in the Green Bond Fund of the Bank for International Settlements as part of sustainable investment strategy. Finally, as doer, the central bank, the BSP, adopts best practices for environmental preservation and greenhouse gas emission reduction, as well as embedding sustainability principles or ESG criteria in our operations. We created a bank-wide technical working groups to conduct vulnerability assessment to determine the impact of climate change to the BSP offices and branches, as well as a gap analysis to identify the areas in the BSP operations where we can embed ESG or green practices or principles or practices. A holistic approach to champion sustainability by enabling, mobilizing, and doing. I'll stop here.
And thank you very much, Governor. Thank you for those remarks, and clearly also moving forward with quite a challenging agenda, including on the areas you cited, enabler, mobilizer, and doer. And in that context, of course, in the ASEAN context, also needing to coordinate across. And I wondered whether you might say a word or two about the coordination efforts on your side, you know, at the ASEAN level, that your specific actions are enabling as well. Apologies, Governor, we can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, could you repeat your question, please?
No, I was just inviting you to speak a little bit to the issues around coordination in the ASEAN context between your own very impressive national program efforts and say Singapore's and of course Indonesia's, and how the work around coordination is enabling you to take things forward.
Yeah, indeed, we coordinate with our ASEAN neighbors on this climate change, because we know that this region will be heavily impacted by this pandemic in the future, right? So we coordinate, of course, with Singapore and Indonesia and Thailand and other ASEAN member countries on this. But in our case, the major our champion here is headed by the Secretary of Finance, and we have what's called the Green Force, and this is consists of course, the central bank, the Department of Finance, the Secretary of Environment and Natural Resources. We have a Climate Change Commission, and so we look at this as a all of government approach. And so harmonization of regulations covering governance risk management, disclosures, and guiding principles for identifying green activities, that is a major responsibility of that Green Force.
And thank you so much, Governor Diokno. And maybe still for a moment on this issue of course, cooperation, coordination, and turning to Minister Sri Mulyani, of course, as co-chair of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, and of course, your upcoming chairmanship of the G20 and ASEAN in 2023, G20 in 2022. I think you spoke to the priorities you would see for the global community already in your opening remarks. I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak more specifically to some of that, including in the Asian context, of course, what issues you see around policy coordination with China and India as well.
Well, first, I think using the platform G20 as well as the coalition of the climate finance, there are at least two issues which is common interest and become a high priority. That is the green recovery and carbon price. I think mainstreaming the climate change into the designing of the recovery of the economy as well as on our fiscal issue, I think it's going to be very, very critical. The second one, if you're talking about the ASEAN, as Ravi mentioned earlier, the developing of the taxonomy on sustainable finance. These are all still a landscape which each of the countries, they are still quite fragmented. So in this case, if we are going to be able to make the ASEAN to have a more consistent taxonomy so that they are going to be able to fit for all, I think that's going to be also an achievement. We also, as a co-chair of ASEAN Working Committee on Capital Market Development, we bring together regulators from banking, insurance, and capital market in the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, and also engaging a key private sector as well as the industry advisory panel to discuss this. I think what the two previous speakers mentioned, it is important for us to come up with the regulatory framework, but because this is still relatively new for the industry, even though we are, for example, implementing the ESG, but the industry has not yet understand how to put this climate or environmental risk within their risk framework. So a lot of what you call it best practice as mentioned earlier, and how this can be assessed, stress test, the standard of stress test, quantifying the risks, I think is going to be very, very important in order for them to have a concrete and put what you call it seems like a future threat within the current risk framework. And I think that's going to be one of the area that we could work together on ASEAN. So it is really complementing between the G20, the coalition of the finance minister on climate change finance, as well as the ASEAN, the discussion on ASEAN. A lot of talk, for example, on a sustainable finance working group within the G20 is going to work also with the ASEAN and task force on climate-related finance disclosure, as well as the coalition of finance minister, will provide a collaboration. And first, of course, putting this as a high priority policy. So it will always come up in those forums, whether you are talking among the coalition, G20, ASEAN, Sustainable Finance Working Group, or the climate-related financial disclosure task force. Then we are going to be able to then provide or generate sustainable reporting standard, which is going to be very critical. As Ravi mentioned earlier, you can always talk about the same thing like climate change, but it could be different policy framework, as well as even the quality of how the policy regulation and institution is going to be established or built. So we can talk about the same thing, but it could be a totally different from country to country. It is actually okay because we have a common but differentiated, but it doesn't mean that then you are not going to have a standard that then compromising the target itself. Because when you are talking, as Ravi mentioned, about the temperature of the global, we are talking about a very specific threat for the global, for the world. So you cannot use a different standard. So this is going to be one of the area. And I think on the finance, we are going to be able to push this much more, because the finance people usually on this, we are talking about central bank, fiscal, or finance industry. We are usually want to be very precise. What we are discussing, how much it costs us, how we are going to pay that, what is the price. So that is usually create a very strong push and more concrete one, rather than maybe discussion at a more abstract or normative level. This is going to be one of the area in which the finance minister can contribute very concretely and very credibly in addressing the issue of climate change.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those responses. Very helpful. Maybe to turn back again to the issue of finance, and to invite Managing Director Menon to maybe update us a bit on. You've talked in the past about the future of capital being green. And I think you spoke a bit about the steps that you've been taking, of course, to make Singapore the hub that it can be for green finance. But just wondered how, whether you could speak to some more specifics around that, and how those steps you're taking to make Singapore that hub will support Asia's transition to a low carbon future.
Yeah, thank you, Antoinette. First off, I'd say that the state of green finance is still very nascent. I know the volume of assets that are being invested in sustainable projects, ESG, is rising very rapidly, but it's from a very low base. So if you look at green finance, it has reached nowhere near the scale that is required. So unlocking transition finance is critical to Asia. I think the other parts of the world need to understand some of the unique challenges in Asia. Parts of Asia are still in need of very basic developmental needs: clean water, electricity, transportation. And so there's a developmental agenda, and Asia's energy supply today is currently strongly fossil fuel based. Coal alone accounts for nearly half the region's total energy supply. So in Asia, the main thing is transition, step by step. How do you move from coal to cleaner fuels and cleaner energy before you finally reach renewables? And to do this, as Minister Sri Mulyani said, in a cost-effective way, without upsetting the developmental agenda. So there's huge need for investments. There are all kinds of estimates. I'd say, just taking one source, which is from the Asian Development Bank, Asia needs about $1.7 trillion a year of investments in sustainable infrastructure right through to 2030. So what we see us playing a role in Singapore is to, because we're a financial center, is to help to channel private capital together with public capital to finance the transition of Asia. I think that's the best contribution we can make. And this means working very closely with our neighbors to understand the issues and challenges on the ground, and to see how financing can be directed in those directions. So we came up with a Green Finance Action Plan, and it has 5 components. Develop green taxonomies. I mentioned that already, so I won't go through that. Second is to promote innovative green finance solutions and to deepen the markets. Third is consistent reporting and disclosure standards, which we need to really address in Asia. I've also spoken about that. Fourth is to harness technology. I think there's a lot of scope to use satellite images and so on to monitor the commitments that are being made. And then finally, to build knowledge and capabilities. This is not trivial. This is a very complex subject, and many of us are still coming to grips with it. And so we need to build these capabilities in sustainable finance. On taxonomy, I'll just add one more point. Many of the financial institutions and banks, especially in Singapore, they lend primarily to the region. And so in the region, the challenges are different from, say, bank lending in Europe or taxonomies that are used in Europe. So they've developed a traffic light system to classify sustainable activities. Sustainable activities are green. Transition activities are yellow. And then the purely unsustainable activities are red. If you apply the European taxonomy, the transition activities will not be recognized because it is still carbon intensive. But you must see where the starting point is. If you're moving from coal to natural gas, that is a transition towards greater, lower carbon emissions. So we need to recognize that when we make financing decisions. So the task force is now developing granular criteria and thresholds so that we can operationalize the classification system. Then there are costs involved in getting green certification. So if a project wants to borrow from a bank, it needs to have a certification that that it is actually green, that this is the promised reduction in carbon footprint. You need an independent verification and certification. So gaining that costs more.
Oh, I'm very sorry. It looks like we're losing Managing Director Menon. Technology challenges, I'm afraid we're experiencing. Let's see if we get him back shortly. But I'll give a task to our technical people to follow up there. But maybe while we're trying to reconnect Managing Director Menon, I might turn to Governor Diokno for a minute. And of course, Philippines being one of the most vulnerable countries in the region, to disaster risk, and it's going to be quite a transition to net zero, and a huge risk in that transition. Just wondered if you could speak a little bit more to what central bank can do to manage risk to financial stability that come from the financial system and the real economy amidst this transition and shocks that a country like Philippines has to contend with.
Indeed, based on a study by the Asian Development Bank, the Philippines stand to lose 6% of its GDP annually by 2100 if climate change risk is not addressed. The same study revealed that if the Philippines invests 0.5% of its GDP by 2020 in climate change adaptation, it can avert losses up to 4% by 2100. We recognize this. As such, the Sustainable Finance Framework emphasizes that banks should study the environmental and climate-related risk, which may exacerbate the financial risk exposure of banks. We conducted a preliminary study on the effect of extreme weather events to banks' performance based on our supervisory data. And the results show that extreme rainfall events result to a decline in loan growth, contraction in deposits, and weakened loan quality as non-performing loans increase. Now, to further study the impact of climate risk to the banking system, the BSP, in collaboration with the World Bank and the WWF Philippines, will conduct vulnerability assessment and stress testing exercises. Now, the results of these studies will be considered to the potential enhancement to the prudential reports submitted by banks to the BSP and the development of guidelines on climate stress testing. And this will enable the BSP to capture necessary data on climate and other environment-related risks, which could be used for surveillance analysis and policy development.
Oh, thank you very much, Governor, for that. Thank you. Very helpful to get updated on those issues. Apologies, Managing Director Menon, we lost you for a little bit, and I took the opportunity to turn to Governor Diokno in the interim. Maybe you want to spend a minute or so to conclude what you were putting out before, and then we'll try to turn to a number of questions we received from the press and other stakeholders before we close for the remaining 10 or 15 minutes we have. Please go ahead.
Yeah, or maybe we can go straight to the questions. I think it'll be interesting to hear what the questions are, and we can try to address them. Yeah, I think Governor Benjamin Diokno has given a good accounting of roughly what I would have said myself. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Managing Director. And maybe we'll put the first question from the public side to you. And we got a question that speaks to the fact that you talked about, of course, Singapore's policy efforts to develop green finance, and we've been talking about that. And the question was, what were the challenges of scaling up green finance more broadly, including cross-border finance and cross-border finance for emerging and developing economies to the levels needed to achieve a substantial dent in addressing climate change? That was one of the questions, so please.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think as I was mentioning in just the previous remarks, scaling up green finance is a huge challenge. Everybody is doing some green finance, but scaling it up, especially cross-border, and to evaluate the performance of the project. If you're lending to a project, say in Thailand or something, and it's a renewable energy project, you need to be able to measure the carbon footprint, the success of the abatement efforts, and so on. And I think if you don't have that kind of assurance, then it becomes difficult. So the two things I mentioned earlier on, one is we need to build an ecosystem of certification bodies, rating systems, and so on, so that a credible third party is a bit like credit ratings in the past. You need green ratings that are credible, because the risk of greenwashing is quite high. And so you need that kind of measurement and certification. And as I said earlier on, agreement on the taxonomy. If you agree on the taxonomy, and then there's a way to measure and certify, then I think the financing will flow. I should say one of the promising things is that many institutional investors actually want to increase their exposure to green assets. This is promising. What they're saying is that I want to make sure it's green and not brown. And many people have, their reputations are damaged when they have lent to something and it turns out not green but brown. So you need this ecosystem to support it. And here I think I was mentioning technology. I don't know if I got lost during that part. You need like IoT devices, satellite images, and so on. So if there's a reforestation project, you need to know whether the trees are there. And you need to be able to monitor the carbon abatement. So the project Greenprint that we launched in MAS is a way to have a digital platform which can collate this information and data so that financial institutions can use them to make their lending decisions or the investment decisions. Stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Managing Director Menon. So another question, actually, that came from the public is I'll turn to Minister Sri Mulyani to maybe tackle that. And you spoke to that a little bit in your opening remarks, I think. But the question is that, of course, carbon pricing being widely seen as essential for tackling climate change. And the question is, why are countries so reluctant to embrace climate carbon pricing, and whether early adaptation of carbon pricing by early adoption of carbon pricing by large countries could help in overcoming this reluctance elsewhere?
Thank you. I think this is very important question. We all know that the market mechanism can be a very powerful way to address the issue of climate change. But climate change is a typical public goods phenomenon in which the market are not reflecting the true value of what is the price or the damage in this case. And so the question is how we are going to address the issue, which is globally very important. And when we talk about the CO2, this is no longer like one local CO2 like Jakarta CO2 or Singapore CO2 or Manila CO2. This is just the CO2 in the air, which is globally is going to be there. So who should pay for what and how much the price that should be settled? That is going to be the most very, very important in dealing with the climate change globally. That should be consistent, but we also recognize that sovereignty and all economy may have a different capacity. So how we are going to also reconcile that? So back to the question, why there is maybe a reluctant or very difficult to convince about this carbon pricing. In fact, Indonesia is actually now also building this in a very early stage. First, because the carbon price has been perceived as creating a regressive impact for the people in this case. So the poor is going to be bear a bigger burden than the rich. And that's not politically good in any economy or any country. So how you are going to compensate this regressivity of this carbon price? Actually, we can do that from the policy design by using the revenue proceed to compensate, providing more support for the low-income household and so on. So that's maybe can be discussed. But the second one, this is across country. The question, who's going to be the first mover? If it is going to be one country adopting this carbon price, and this is then definitely will seen as additional burden for the industry. So there will be then the question from the business community that we are outcompete with other country who is not adopting this policy. So why we should do first? Like for example, in the ASEAN, I was actually received question from my colleague from the business. They're asking, Ibu, Minister of Finance, why you are promoting this policy while other ASEAN countries, there seems like not yet forthcoming? Is it not providing and creating Indonesia in a disadvantaged position vis-a-vis other countries so that the company can easily relocate to the much lower standard? And that's really a real issue, a very, very serious real issue. The third one is, of course, also your second question is if the advanced country can adopt this first, will that very helpful? Certainly, yeah. Of course, if they are going to do this first and creating a market which is more reliable, as Ravi mentioned earlier, this will require quite a lot of the monitoring, reporting, valuation. You really have to impute the price in a more credible, consistent way. Again, because you're actually talking about the same commodity, that is CO2, whether this is produced in Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, and other, they are all the same CO2. So if you have a different price, there will be a leakage. There will be like, yeah, what you call it, the market, which is not going to be really can be enforced in a credible and consistent way. That is really the difficulty. But somebody have to start, and then we are going to complement this with many of what you call it a regulatory framework that can be adopted more globally, so that it will not just like this is the discussion, Antoinette, like in a G20 when we are talking about taxation, global taxation, because we don't want race to the bottom for country to continue lower the tax rate up to the bottom, so that country will definitely losing the base of their tax, so base erosion tax, as well as then we are all don't have the domestic resource mobilization to finance so many other, as MD Menon mentioned earlier. We have so many development agenda that still need to be financed. So this is going to be not just whether you have a political will, but whether your political will end up in a political difficulty that is not going to be sustainable for you. It's going to be a very, very important for a country to be able to adopt. And that's why this coalition and working together is going to be important. The more the world can establish a mechanism that the free rider or those who actually becoming the late participant without any consequence, then the more effective we are going to address this issue climate change. But if the free rider or whoever country can say, okay, let other people doing it, I'm going to be the last one, and then that there is no consequences, then everybody have no incentive to become the first mover, because they know that this is going to lead. And that's why the role of IMF is going to be also very important, Antoinette. You mentioned about the bilateral surveillance. You are, as an institution, you also can establish a standard setter, as well as putting and mobilizing the global collaboration on establishing, because this is a global problem. This is not one individual country problem, but each country have very important role to be able to be in the same pace and the same speed, so that we are going to be able to address this issue effectively. Thank you.
So well put, Minister Sri Mulyani, so well explained and put around the political challenges and the issues around convincing the domestic constituency about all of these things. And I think in that regard, you know, an international carbon price certainly has this potential. And, you know, we certainly want to continue to work to you know, get more consensus around moving towards that because it is potentially quite helpful in dealing with some of the issues around leakages and competitiveness that you've been also spelling out. I just wanted to ask whether it was okay to run over by 5 minutes since we started a few minutes late to give an opportunity for one last question that came from the public that the two governors might take a crack at briefly, and that is around the issues around moving away from coal and the introduction of carbon pricing, and whether that could lead to higher inflation. That's a question that we've received. And whether this could then hinder the recovery from the pandemic and what it would mean for monetary policy. Any thoughts on that from both of you, Governor Diokno and Senator Menon? Yes.
So the primary mandate of most central banks like BSP is to maintain price stability consistent with sustainable economic growth. So the BSP may have to consider the effects of carbon pricing and transition away from, say, coal energy on inflation to more expensive energy in determining whether appropriate policy settings, particularly over a long period. The Philippines, through the Department of Finance, is currently studying the possibility of adopting an intensity-based carbon emissions trading, or ETS, over carbon tax. However, based on the report of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or UNESCAP, that the inflationary impact of a carbon tax in 16 countries in Asia and the Pacific, including the Philippines, dissipates within 5 years after implementation and could be followed by a period of disinflation. So the timing and extent of the implementation of climate policies will determine the impact on the economic recovery. Similarly, on how the economic scarring from pandemic-affected sectors and workers differently, high contact or low contact sectors, the transition to a low carbon economy would likewise depend on the unique economic structure and adaptability of both labor and goods market. So we want to emphasize, however, that government policy changes that directly affects prices, such as carbon taxes or subsidizing renewables, are beyond the scope of monetary policy. In any case, we will continue to monitor potential second-round effects that could emanate from an uptick in oil prices, which could disanchor inflation expectation from the target. I'll stop here.
Very helpful, Governor Diokno. Thank you so much. Last word to Managing Director Menon on that question.
Yeah, I fully agree with Governor Diokno, so I won't repeat what he said. But we need to remember that the transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy will likely, especially in Asia, lead to higher long-term energy costs for the economy. In fact, we need to remember it is the intended effect of such a shift, either through carbon taxes or switching to more costly renewable energy, because we are trying to measure the true social cost of fossil fuels. So once you price it in, then the measured consumer price index will then go up. And that is what is going to make the shift. You induce users to switch to more sustainable sources of energy. So you need to bring about a relative price change, and that will increase overall cost. Now, that said, the empirical studies we have seen so far have shown that the direct inflationary effects of orderly increases in carbon prices, and here you can look at the examples in Europe, where over a 10 or 15-year period, they've increased carbon prices steadily. But when you do it in a gradual, progressive, steady fashion over time, then the inflationary effects are very limited. I'm not saying, therefore, it will be the same in Asia in the future, but I think that gives us some idea that if you do an orderly change in carbon prices, the inflationary effects can be managed. And as for central banks, the our role is always to look at containing inflation, whatever the source is. We don't seek to contain pressures coming from relative price changes. Every now and then you will have oil price increase. I think central banks will see through that and ask, is this going to have a sustained effect on inflation in the country? If it is, then we'll act. If it's not, it's a relative price change, once off, then we let it pass through. So I think in this sphere, we need to also exercise that kind of judgment. And so I think it's very important that the central bank works closely with the Ministry of Finance, because if the Ministry of Finance can engineer a gradual rise in carbon prices, it should be largely not inflationary, and the central bank is better placed than to focus on its price mandate. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for that last very informative response. And thank you for an hour, more than an hour of a very, very illuminating, stimulating conversation we've had, I think, around an issue with all sorts of challenges, of course, to be navigated in addressing the issue of climate change. And, you know, technical challenges, of course, around data, taxonomy, you know, deepening green financial markets and the challenges there, the issues around carbon pricing and political economy considerations and pressures, the global challenges around collaboration. We've covered quite a bit of ground, and just underscoring the complex issue we're dealing with, but also the urgency of finding solutions to it. And we, from the fund side, of course, very much wanting to support the international community in really moving forward to address this, you know, just the issue of our time, and you know, to avert all of the disaster we know comes with it. So we are really grateful for really bringing us up to speed on all of the work that's ongoing across Asia and in ASEAN in particular. And we will be, of course, coming back to these issues in our dialogue with all of you, and in all of our joint efforts at the global level in the G20 context and other areas as well. Very grateful to Minister Sri Mulyani for agreeing to co-host this event with us. Very, very happy that all of you were able to participate. So my thanks to Governor Menon and Governor Managing Director Menon, Governor Diokno, and Minister Sri Mulyani for giving us this opportunity and time. All the best, and we'll be seeing you in the annual meetings. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.